Hello, good evening, and welcome to this special press conference being hosted by the Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mia Mormali. This afternoon, the Prime Minister will address the nation on several matters of national importance, as well as take questions from the members of the media who are here present. With the Prime Minister are the Minister in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, the Honorable Ryan Strawn, as well as the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs, Mr. Ian Carrington. So without further ado, I turn it over to the Prime Minister. PM.
Thank you very much, Alex. Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to members of the media. Let me say how good it is to see you all in person again and not on a screen. So that's the first thing. At the outset, I want to offer my own sympathy and that of the governments again to the royal family, to King Charles III, to the Queen Consort, to all of Her Majesty's children, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward, and the wider family, and of course to the people and government of the United Kingdom. Her Majesty's reign really can reflect a commitment to duty beyond perhaps very few others, and very few others have surpassed what she was able to achieve. On my way here, I was reflecting on the number of countries that were independent from the British Empire prior to 1952, and recognized that Her Majesty really spanned a reign that went from empire to post-independence, and that she had therefore in her leadership to be able to reflect while being in charge of the United Kingdom as its head, while reflecting British values, to be able to transition from a world that became very, very different from the one in which she assumed the throne. 1952 is a far, far cry from 2022. And the mere fact that the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who was the last Prime Minister that she swore in, from Winston Churchill, the first, that the difference between the years when they were born is a century, tells the story perhaps better than any other metric. The Queen took on the responsibility while Morse code was still the dominant mode of communication. Today, I speak to you globally simply through the technology that is available, and could do so on a telephone if we wanted to. I believe, therefore, that the stability which she brought to the passage of the United Kingdom from that of an empire to one of the countries that is certainly a leading developed country of the world, but not an empire, reflects her ability to recognize that change was happening and that she could anchor that change through her commitment to duty, her stability, her reflection of the best values, and by ensuring at the same time a sense of fairness and openness that has allowed diversity to creep in every aspect of the culture of the United Kingdom. I have every confidence and will have an opportunity in the future again to speak to the reign of King Charles III. We view him as a friend of Barbados, and as you know, as we transitioned from being a republic to a republic last year, that King Charles joined us and was very clear to recommit to the bonds of friendship that we have between our two countries, and I do so again today. I've said on other occasions that he has been a man ahead of his time, and it has stood out for me his commitment to the environment, to biodiversity, to urban renewal, to architectural integrity, but above all else, to creating pathways for young people, particularly those who may be at risk and who may not be seen, heard, or felt by others in their community or their families. It is also of significance to me, and I was not in Rwanda, but I had a copy of the speech, that in dealing with matters of great importance to those of us who are former colonies, especially where slavery was a dominant mode for regrettably too long, that the King has reflected in his last speech to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that the conversation for how we treat to the scar of slavery and to the reparatory work that must be done as a result of it is a conversation whose time has come. I believe that he has been, as I said, a man ahead of his time, and I look forward to how he will assume his responsibilities as King of England as we go forward. My friends, this press conference was originally called yesterday, prior to the passing of Her Majesty, but out of deference and given the fact that our own President, the Most Honourable Dame Sandra Mason, would have spoken on behalf of the people and government of Barbados, we decided to postpone it to today. When I did the budget in March, I promised a few things, and I indicated and repeated that along the way. One of them was that we would consult and that we would come back to the country with a clear decision as to where we go, given that the program with the International Monetary Fund comes to an end formally at the end of this month. We have had those consultations starting as early as June and July with the social partners, the private sector and the labour movement. We've met with other smaller and larger groups, and the Cabinet yesterday agreed that we will formally approach the International Monetary Fund again with a letter that I propose to sign this afternoon to the Managing Director asking for discussions and negotiations to resume. Why? Because we are living, as we all know, in very difficult and uncertain times. And in a world where a number of countries, indeed, I think that the numbers are in excess of 40 countries that are on the brink of debt difficulties and debt crisis, that we are conscious that between that and the monetary stance that has been taken by most central banks to be able to control inflation has led to an increase in the cost of borrowing. We have been of the view that the cheapest money in town is still at the International Monetary Fund. In addition to that, it also unlocks other development funds that may be made available to us as a nation. And indeed, about an hour ago, I spoke to the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, who confirmed what the limits and potential is for Barbados, both in the rest of this year, 2022, and in 2023, with respect to the funding that can be made available to us. We also believe that in addition to that, that what is being asked of us does not vary thus far from our own Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Program, adjustments to which we will make willingly because we recognize how we need to hone what we are doing in the ability to recover from a COVID environment, but at the same time also to lay that platform for growth. Those discussions, should they start and be successful, will probably make available to us in the vicinity the equivalent of about 130 million US, or what is the equivalent of 90% of quota. But more importantly, what it does is that it unlocks for us access to a new facility that the International Monetary Fund has established, largely as a result of our own urgings. It is not perfect in the way it has been designed and structured, but it is a long way from that which has anything else that exists for middle-income countries such as ourselves. I'm referring to the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which will make available to us another 150 million, 150% of quota, and probably in the vicinity of 200 to 210 million US on top of the 150 million US that we hope to be able to negotiate, 130 million US we hope to be able to negotiate for. So 150% of quota, 210 million US is the target that we are looking for with respect to the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And for the extended funded facility, we're looking for a 3-year program instead of a 4-year program, but that will be 90% of quota, and that will allow 130 million US to be unlocked. So from the IMF total we're looking at 340 million US to be able to assist us over the course of the next 3 years. You ask why again? At the end of the day, if the world is in an environment where the rain is falling hard, you need to find a raincoat, you need to find an umbrella, and you need to find boots. And Barbados believes that this is not the time for us to simply go out there at this point in time, given all of the global uncertainty and given the increases in the costs of borrowing and the cost of capital. In addition to that, those things that we have been able to do in the first program, with our first BERT program, 2018, have allowed us to get in large measure to where we need to be. But we recognize that because of COVID, there's still work that remains unfinished. The work with respect to completing the restructuring and repurposing of our state-owned enterprises is a work in progress that we had put a pause on largely because of COVID. We also believe that there's tremendous opportunity for growth. I hear a lot of people speaking, but we forget that the World Economic Outlook, issued in April of this year, has Barbados projected to grow at about 11.2%. And with respect to the other countries of the world, go and check for yourself. I believe that the only country that is expected to have greater growth than us is Guyana at 47%. But you are free to go and check for yourself, particularly since I see all kinds of media commentary, and both from established entities as well as individuals crying out for growth without realizing that Barbados' growth path is pretty much there. The last press briefing of the governor of the central bank reflected a 10% growth figure, and we expect that that figure will continue to hold going into the rest of the year. Can it be better and stronger? It always can be, but Barbados is holding its own, and up to this morning I opened a facility for another $12 million investment at Bayview for the establishment of an emergency facility to be able to expand the services offered by that hospital. As I said then, people will not risk their funds in an economy that they do not have confidence in, and that is the bottom line. We do have before us other projects that will continue to unfold, but let us also be real. Part of the difficulty of the environment in which we live in is that even though we have burst of COVID, COVID still has an impact on people's productivity and on people's capacity to turn up for the job. And we see that no more clearer than in the airline industry, which has been struggling, as you know, in order to be able to get the staff, to be able to put on the flights that they need in order to keep the planes flying as they would like. In addition to that, as I said, we're very clear that the continued pillars for this economy has to continue for training and with respect to the National Transformation Initiative and the other training programs like Construction Gateway, so that we're in a better position to be able to have Barbadians be ready for the opportunities that will be made available in the next few years. Similarly, we will be receiving the benefit of a labor market information specialist, which we're sharing with Guyana, one of the top ones coming out of India, to be able to help us refine better that pathway for training to match the skills of the labor market. Our work in agriculture and food security, as you have been hearing, is continuing apace, and Barbados will have to be that logistics hub, marrying its geography, its access to flights, its access to maritime opportunities for shipping, with those in the rest of the region who perhaps may not have the same level of access. You would have heard me speak earlier about opening up northern Brazil, which is critical for us, and only last week we also entertained a team from there with respect to the fact that they can supply with vegetables and produce and fish, but they are landlocked, and therefore without working with Guyana and Barbados, they're not going to be able to get their produce to the markets in the same way. We also believe that Barbados can be that domicile also for life sciences and biomedical industries, and right now we are awaiting the completion of a survey, a study rather, that is being done by Deloitte for the Barbados Industrial Development Corporation that will guide us with respect to the remaining framework that needs to be put in place for that industry. In addition to that, the renewable energy process continues. I'm happy that the Fair Trading Commission has been moving and making certain decisions, and we are also working. The Ministry of Energy has literally deconstructed the whole process to ensure that the commitment which we made to the people of Barbados for persons to have, as of right, renewable energy opportunities on their housing, and then also to de-risk the housing that we have, that we're in a position to do that going forward. And I'm satisfied that over the course of the next 6 months, we are going to see all of those things come fully to fruition. In addition to the renewable energy, the housing program remains critical for us as a key part of the component, and what we are trying to do is to de-risk it as much as possible. In other words, to make as many Barbadians capable of being owners, not only on the basis of their own income, but that income, when combined with the opportunities presented with the photovoltaic panels, that they're in a position to benefit from that. And while we've had some hiccups with respect to the East-West Chinese housing solution, we are awaiting the persons to come for the additional training, and that has been a difficulty because of the absence of the transit visas. We've made representation yet again to the British High Commission last week that those visas are needed in order to be able to do the training that we need for our people. With respect to the other projects, we are satisfied that those will be on stream, as well as working with the banks and the Housing Credit Fund to create the opportunities for liquidity. That is why you see the National Housing Corporation doing as many housing fairs as possible, because at the end of the day, the more people that are prepared to and can access mortgages, the more houses that can be built to satisfy the need. By the same token, the National Housing Corporation will continue to be that entity that will provide housing for those Barbadians who cannot yet afford to be able to access a mortgage, but who will have to be part of a rent-to-own 30-year program, so that at the end of the day, they still become owners, but government is carrying them along the way because of their inability to be able to access mortgages. I also want to announce this afternoon that we really need, and we will be reaching out to the private sector, in particular, some of whose members have not been complying with the request from the Statistical Services Department on the surveys that are being carried out. And you may say, why are you humbugging us with more paper? Because at the end of the day, if we do not capture the size of this economy appropriately, it restricts the amount of fiscal space, the amount of room that government will have to spend going forward. So when you have entities, as I see here, who are in the business of literally production, but are refusing to cooperate for the collection of data going back 2014, 2015, 2016, entities that are still very much in existence, 2018, then we have a problem. And I have asked the Attorney General as well as Minister Strawn to let us do any amendments that we need to the legislation, because we need to measure what we are doing and how much we are earning in this economy. And very often what is happening is that our failure to measure all of the activity, both within the formal sector and even in terms of the informal sector, means that we are limiting ourselves in terms of our possibilities. And that is our problem, not anybody else's problem. So I'm asking formally, and I'm asking the media formally, to treat this as a special reach out, shout out, call it whatever you want, that we need Barbadian companies and individuals to cooperate, whether it was the census, whether it is the Statistical Services questionnaires, central banks questionnaires that come. All of these things may appear unsexy to you, but they have a very real benefit and consequence. Benefit if it's done properly and we collect the data, and if we don't do it, then it means that we're not in a position to appropriately estimate what is taking place with respect to that. The last thing I want to address in terms of the economy is the question of the commitment I gave in March for wages and salaries to negotiations and allowances to start. I have given instructions that that should happen before the end of September, And I am hoping, therefore, that we can see that process put properly on the table so that persons on behalf of the labor unions and those on behalf of government can sit down and appropriately assess where we are and what the future is. I'm not going to prejudice those discussions by making any comments on it this afternoon, other than to say that the process must start, and that process, I hope, will therefore start before the end of September, as we gave the commitment in March when I delivered the budget this year. I think that one of the things you would have probably picked up, we came in March, we came in July, and we're monitoring closely what is happening. The measures that we put in place for the cost of living, I expect that the Department of Commerce shall be publishing soon a sample of some of the prices that they have been able to be tracking, and to recognize that in some instances, let me put it another way, the majority of people are working with the prices that have been recommended. There are a few instances, 2 or 3, in some commodities where people are still charging more. But I suppose people will balance those higher charges with convenience and determine whether that is a price that they're prepared to pay, especially since in some instances there are smaller units that may have a more limited base. But Ryan can speak to that later if he wishes to. With respect to the other issues that have been happening in the country, I couldn't have a press briefing without just saying a few words on this issue of violence and crime in Barbados, and I'm happy that this week seems to have quietened down. But suffice it to say that the Attorney General has spoken more than once, and he's been correct in indicating that this is not a problem that is going to be solved overnight, and it's not going to be a problem that's going to be solved by government alone. We have a number of things that we have to confront, and certainly government has its role, just as the police has its role, just as the law courts have their role, and just as families and communities and individual Barbadians have their role. We cannot divorce ourselves from what is happening globally either. Last Sunday, you listened to Fareed Zakaria. The entire program was on what? On guns. Because we have a problem with the level of guns that have been made available, regrettably, in the last decade or two, and that has included and extended to automatic weapons. So when people want to resolve conflict, whereas before they found different ways to do so, now they use the weapons, regrettably, that can cause serious damage and life loss. The end of the day as well, we've reached a point where we are paying for what has happened. You cannot have people leave school, have no opportunities for work, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, and then all of a sudden believe that they're going to come back into mainstream society just so. Barbados has a number of issues that have accumulated over time. And I can sit here and try to say this one or that one or whatever. I keep telling you, I do not have eyes in the back of my head. But what I do know is that each of us has control over what we do in the next minute, the next hour, the next day, the next week, the next month. And I therefore want to be able to speak to Bajans now directly, and to families and to communities, because it is us who can take care of one another. And if we don't speak to those who want to risk our lives by gunplay or by keeping guns, then we're going to find that the people who they love and we love are going to be the biggest victims of all. The system has also suffered, regrettably, from COVID, and you may ask how. When you don't have jury trials for the better part of 2 years, then you get a build-up of cases again. But in addition to that, you have a situation where judges, properly following the law, will tell you that you can't keep a person in custody for beyond X amount of time without it being a breach of their rights. And therefore, they will not necessarily be taken into account COVID, but COVID is running down the time as well. In addition to that, I can't help but reflect on this, and I got the data from the Attorney General only this week again. We have, let me pull it up and I'll show you all after. We have a list of murder cases that, quite frankly, 80% of them, and I'll give it to you to look at and look at the dates yourself, 80% of the murder cases in this country that are now to be heard before the courts still predate this government coming into office. 80%. And that's in spite of the fact that we have created another 5 judges and that we have also created additional posts for the DPP. As I said, I get it, because obviously during COVID, you know what was shut down. You know what couldn't happen. And therefore, that has retarded things a bit. I look at the number of gun cases as well. 80% or so, once again, of the gun cases, 20 pages here of persons charged, before this government even came to office. Now, that's not an excuse, and I don't want it to be an excuse. But I say to the cabinet all the time that we must have context and perspective. And I want us to have context and perspective as a country too. Bottom line is, if you are encouraging persons by letting them believe that it is okay to get away, then we have a problem. And that's why I say that this has to be a whole of nation approach. By the same token, the government will continue, as has happened, to provide the funding to the police. And I've indicated to the police as recent as the last Security Council meeting, but I did it publicly when the cabinet was sworn in January, that we are prepared to entertain an increase in the numbers, because there are a number of vacancies still, and we are prepared to increase the numbers there. We are prepared, I told the AG again if necessary, to even increase some temporary judges to remove this backlog, especially given the damage that COVID put in it again, through to no fault of anyone's. But if we can do those things, that still will not be enough, because what we're dealing with is a value system that has changed, and accessibility to weapons that regrettably are being too readily available throughout the world, and in particular throughout the Americas. And let me say, I recall the press reports 6-7 years ago about guns coming in through the port. You remember that? The then Commissioner of Police, the then Attorney General, and we empathize with them. But guess what? Guns don't evaporate. They're not perishable. So that once they come in, where are they? More likely than not, they're still here. And while the police have been doing a very good job in being able to restrict the numbers coming in, and while we've spent millions of dollars putting scanners at the airport and the seaport, the reality is that we still have guns on the ground in this community. And unless we reach, left to me alone, I think we should have a discussion about whether guns ought to be a part of our landscape or not. But I accept that there are people who feel that the issue is too far gone, and that those who have legitimate rights to defend themselves with licenses ought to be able to do so. Problem is that when people become desensitized to killing, guns become an appropriate tool for them. And that's the difficulty that we are facing. So unless we start to have discussions in our homes, in our communities, in our community clubs, this is not about government alone. Cannot be, has never been. But government has an essential role to play with the provision of policies and legislation for law enforcement. There is an amendment that will come that will correct the section of the Firearms Act that struck down the mandatory sentencing, and that amendment pretty much, we believe, can follow that which is being done in the United Kingdom, in Turks and Caicos, and in other countries, where the sentence of imprisonment for possession of guns will be mandatory unless there are exceptional circumstances that the judge is satisfied that can be there. That amendment must come to the House now, and the AG will bring that shortly. But the bottom line is, my friends, we must treat to this as one people and as one nation. And I hope and pray that we understand the gravity of what we're dealing with, that this has been the subject that has been contained within groups is no comfort to anyone. But at the end of the day, Barbados is too small to entertain this kind of violence. And whether the violence is guns ultimately, or whether it is other types of violence, domestic violence, verbal abuse, whatever, we believe that as a nation we need to deal with it. And as a region, heads of government have also agreed that we must treat the violence as the public health disease that it is. The Caribbean, regrettably, has too high a rate of homicide per capita as compared to other countries. And a large part of that is as a result of the easy access of weapons and the openness of our societies, given how they're structured and given how we make our living through trade and tourism on a daily basis. So, my friends, I felt that it was important to discuss with you on, one, the announcement that we are going back into the IMF program and that we will start those discussions later this month. Two, that we need the capacity and the compliance of the private sector with respect to data in a way that regrettably has not been as consistent as we would like it or as it used to be. And those persons who know that they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and that's why they want to stay under the radar. You can't stay under the radar, so we could as well do it the right way and comply and let us get the data. And thirdly, that, as I said, that the discussions with the labor unions, with government, with respect to terms and conditions of employment, will start. As you know, we had done the 5% increase in 2018, the government having had no increase in wages for the 9 years before then. And finally, I've shared with you some perspectives on the violence issue. It is not going to be solved overnight, but by the same token, Barbadians cannot walk away. None of us, government, police, the law courts, families, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, girlfriends, boyfriends, all of us have a role to play in this. And let us, I never see a man walk from the dead yet. And it's song trite, but I never see a walking dead. And therefore, if we don't value life, this is what we will do. But so long as we want to live, and so long as we don't want the people next to us, who we love, because when are people going to come after people? When they're most vulnerable, when they're most relaxed. And when they're most vulnerable and when they're most relaxed, who they're likely to be with? The people that they love the most. So we're putting those who we love at risk. Now, if people want to fight, tell us, and we'll find somewhere for you to go and fight, but not out here and not in Barbados. But if you want to be around here, respect the fact that a small island cannot accommodate this level of violence, and that the police and that the courts will do their part, but their part will always be catch up. Prevention comes from who? From all of us. All of us. And that is why we will continue to put the programs out there at the community level, to have the training in cultural and sports industries and in other areas, construction gateway, all of the things that will allow people to be able to earn and hopefully to avoid that old time saying that the devil finds work for idle hands. Let us stay busy doing things that will add value to our families and to our communities. I'll pause at this stage because I'm sure that many of you may have questions, and Ryan is available, DFE is available, and myself, and we hear what you have to ask.
This right here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Madam Prime Minister, you just announced that we are re-entering into an IMF program. Could you say... Okay. Right. Could you say if pension reform would be featured in this? Also, some might argue that it's because of this why we are re-entering into one.
Because
You gave some reasons, but you did not say
Because
anything
of
about
what?
pension reform.
No, pension
And-
reform is part of the last program. It's not part of the current program. And pension reform, I announced pension reform for the public sector in March, and I also indicated that we are going to put Barbados's national insurance scheme on a steady footing. I told the country it is not in crisis. It isn't. There are some Caribbean countries that are 5 years or 6 years away from the date of doom in terms of their amounts. The FE who currently serve there will tell you that. I don't want that for Barbados. Let us have a 15 to 17 year window to do it right. If you give yourself more time to lose weight, it don't be as dread as if you got to do it in 2 weeks. Not that that is a problem, Wendy, you will ever have. But you understand my point? So all we are doing is literally trying to govern well. And this government could have as easily kicked it down the road as others have. But in our view, Barbados is not a country that exists only for the period of one electoral term of a government. Barbados is our home. And if Barbados is our home, we have a duty to speak frankly with each other and to correct the things that we can correct. So that when I say to you that this can be a problem down the line based on the recommendations that we're getting, let us have the discussion and let us get it out the way. Now the NIS has been doing, they've done consultations through town hall meetings, they've done electronic surveys, they've done an actual poll, they've done a whole host of things which will then allow them to make recommendations to us as a government, and we will then make recommendations. But we are conscious that we have 15 to 17 years, and that what is likely to happen is that we are going to take this in doses and phases in order to be able to ensure that we can run the race appropriately and protect the pensions for as many Barbadians as possible. But hopefully, I hope that the awareness is also there, because I am also conscious that when COVID broke, the amount of people that then reached out to us for support from the NIS, who and where there were no benefits, caused us to have to introduce new benefits in order to keep people's heads above water. And I used the analogy earlier of rain and raincoats and umbrellas and boots, not by accident. So I want the country to get accustomed to recognizing that we have some issues. And you see, this thing with a phone or this thing with a TV, where we believe that everything is instantaneous, we still have to plan and we still have to prepare for the future. And if we want to reap corn, what we got to do? Got to plant it. We know the song well, we know the experience well.
Minister,
Yes.
Colville Munzi from Nation News. Just to get some clarity, is this going to be an additional EFF
Yes.
as we complete
Yes.
both, as opposed to a second homegrown plan? And also, could you do you anticipate additional?
I don't know who wrote that question for you, Corval, because it didn't make any sense. Let me break it down for you.
Right.
There will be a Barbados Economic Recovery Transformation Program 2022. When we go into discussions with the IMF, they recognize it more than us. It is better that the program be homegrown, because when it is homegrown, what does that mean? That we are more likely to implement it without resistance and without difficulty. So yes, there will be an extended fund facility, a new EFF. I've said it would be a 3-year as opposed to a 4-year program. But with respect to the BERT program, that allows us to say to them, in coming to this program, this is how we view Barbados's development and economic recovery and transformation in the next few years. Because they see that there, it means that there is usually less of a distance separating us and them in the negotiations. Okay? Now, there are some countries that allowed them, and remember when we started the first BERT program, the then governor, the former governor of the central bank, Delisle Worrell, recommended that we don't do any debt restructuring, and that the consequences would have been what, 5,000 to 7,000 people being sent home. Can you imagine what would have happened if we had sent home 5,000 to 7,000 people and 2 years into that we got COVID? Can you imagine what this landscape would have looked like? Can you imagine, therefore, that when we say that we are going to restructure state-owned enterprises rather than just simply arbitrarily sending home people, it is because we believe through economic enfranchisement and through retraining, we can create opportunities for those same people to deliver goods and services. We also believe that beyond the boundaries of Barbados, that there are opportunities for work. There's a program for there's a shortage of cybersecurity workers globally. And we believe that we can train more people to deliver those services from here. So that the combination of those things is what drives the BERT program. And there are 6 pillars, Ryan can share them with you, that we feel are fundamental to driving the BERT program. But that is not imposed on us. What that does is allow us to go to the discussions and to recognize that there are certain things that we want to do. For example, we just come out of an IMF program. They haven't asked us to create a fiscal council, but this government probably will create a fiscal council early next year. We're not going immediately to the market for funds, other than the debt for nature swap that Ryan has been anchoring for me, that will see us repurchase 150 million US dollars of our 500 million US dollar euro bond, and to have that at lower interest rates, and that the interest savings will go to help finance a marine conservation trust so we can start the marine spatial planning. The only thing that prohibits us going to the market ultimately is debt and credit ratings. Barbados has had stable outlooks and increase in its improvements in credit rating. You remember the 23 downgrades we had? Nobody don't talk about it anymore. But instead of downgrades, what have we had? In spite of COVID, in spite of the hurricane, Elsa, in spite of the freak storm, and in spite of the inflationary pressures as a result of the Ukraine war, Barbados has not gotten a credit downgrade. Why? And that's why I'm amazed. Last week I read the Nation's editorial. The Nation editorial told us that we did not have a prospectus for the Boss bonds, when not only did we go to Parliament, but a prospectus was issued by Central Bank. They told us that our finances were in perilous circumstances, but the last IMF report that is independent told us that Barbados' finances was in good shape. So I begin to feel that there's some other agenda out there that I'm not aware of, particularly when the agenda is not premised on facts. If the agenda was premised on facts, you got me. Hook, line, and sinker. But when it is not premised on facts, when I can hear on the news this week from other news entities that we have a problem with growth in this country, but yet Barbados is likely to record the highest growth in the world with the exception of Guyana in this year. Now, granted, percentages are all relative. But even being relative, we're doing more than others. And that's what it effectively says. With the capacity and where we are, we're doing better than most. Are we doing what I would like to see? What he would like to see? What he would like to see? Not fully yet. But that's because we are literally buffeted, boom, 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 from pillar to post on things that we have no control of. And I listened to Prime Minister Truss this week. Her energy plan is to go until when? What month? Sorry? The end of January. Our cost of living plan is to go until when? The end of January. Ours came out when? In July. When we were talking about doing the pandemic levy, they all carried stories and said, oh, the government introducing retroactive legislation, taxation, and come against us. What happened? Rishi Sunak, what he do? Same thing. You understand? Other countries in the world all talking about windfall taxes. And all we've said is that, look, a tax that we announced today to start 3 months from now can't be retroactive. And if its base is historic, well then so is personal income taxes and corporation taxes and VAT. You don't pay taxes on the income you intend to earn. You pay taxes on what you have earned. Okay? So when I look and see what other countries are doing, both in terms of the same policies, following us, in many instances, we follow some too. But when we look and see, then we realize that, look, this world in which we are living is not easy. And that you literally have to just pause and look at, you know when the wicket playing funny? You know, you got to stop every so often and just look around and see. This wicket is playing funny. Not because of anything we've done, but because of circumstances completely beyond our control. Who would ever have thought that 96 degrees in the shade was an understatement for weather on this earth? You see the heat waves coming. Who would have thought that the numbers of people in Pakistan recently, in China, in the States, who lost their lives or lost their properties from flooding? So I don't say these things because it's easy to say them. And I see that the other side say that, what? You don't have to listen to me, I talk good. Well, I wish I didn't talk good. I wish I could talk little and you see the actions. Because the actions is what matter. And this government has been one of the few countries that has come through an IMF program, passing almost all of the tests, doing the structural transformation. We were hobbled by COVID, but we are not down and out. And any slippage that we had, we intend to make up. Now, what does that mean? That people must be able to work. That's what we're looking for, jobs. Government took up some of the slack during the pandemic. We need now some of that slack to shift back to the private economy so that government doesn't end back up in a spiral, increasing its debt beyond that which it can pay. None of us want to be in a position again where we spend 40, 50, 60 cents every dollar in debt. So I come to you, and my approach to governance has been like a family. Barbados is one big family. And there are going to be times when we have good conversations, and there are going to be times when the conversation is difficult. Conversation on guns, difficult. Because we didn't get there overnight, and it didn't get solved overnight. On this economy, however, we have had substantive progress, and we intend to be able to build on it. But it does mean that we need cooperation in certain areas. It does mean that there may be need for sacrifice in other areas. And in other areas, we need innovation and greater efforts at productivity.
Oh, sorry.
If I can ask a question of Mr. Strawn and Mr. Carrington, Wendy Burke, CBC. Now, in terms of the program that we're just going into the discussions to ask about the funds, but should it be given and granted, given their approval of the first homegrown program, can we see major fundamental changes to the new program, one? And two, will there also be benefits for Barbadians as in the bonds that we've seen before?
Thanks very much, Wendy, for the question. As the Prime Minister clearly articulated in her comments, we had to pause some of the very critical reforms because of COVID-19. And it is important for the country to understand that what has transpired certainly over the last 4 years, particularly during the first 19 months of the administration, allowed us the space to be capable of responding to the pandemic. You would recall when we came to office, sewage was still flowing in the streets. There were travel advisories from all of our major markets about coming to Barbados. The business climate, the investment climate was considerably different. And what we must understand now is that yes, COVID has had a devastating blow on personal finances for a number of people. The government has had to adjust its reform efforts to be able to take care of people for the last 2 years. And whilst at the end of this month, actually, we come to the end of the grace period with respect to the payment of interest only on the debt. And from October 1st, we now have to start paying interest as well as principal. So our focus in this transitionary period in looking at what is happening with the global uncertainty is to reinforce the point that, yes, government, we are trying to facilitate growth. We need the private sector to be able to look both inward as well as outward, and that is why last week we had that conference with the African Exim Bank to be able to bring additional financing to be able to grow the economy. So exporting now has to become a critical element, not just of physical goods, but exports of services, the cultural products, if you like. You saw the opening of the video game factory not factory, but for programming specifically, to be able to have young people debug programs for global games. So you've started to see some of the very critical things that we want to be able to expose people to, and that's why the training is so important. And therefore, the benefit for Barbadians in being able to stay this course is that we have to now shift to make sure that we accelerate those reforms that we were unable to pursue in the last 2 years because we had to deal with COVID. And therefore, that along with the other measures that we've put in place to be able to bring additional activity here. And here's the thing, for the last, 40, 50 years, Barbados has catered mainly to either North America or European markets. Our strategic push, even in the midst of the pandemic, was to establish those missions in Ghana and in Kenya to recognize that on the African continent, there are global companies that we in Barbados too can give the same level of service as we have given Canadian companies, American companies, and European companies right here. And therefore our focus, if you like, as a country now, has shifted in a sense in being able to bring new business to Barbados, open up new opportunities. And even before this press conference started, reference was made to the fact that there's actually an African company on the ground with respect to being able to push digital payments, which Barbadians now, once they adopt the technology, will be able to lower the cost of doing business, but also be able to export globally because we are opening up the payment bridges to allow Barbadians to provide their services globally and to be paid. Therefore, these are some of the very critical reforms that I want to emphasize, perspective, because by any measure, there is a lot of confidence in Barbados, but from outside. And therefore, even with respect to the boss bonds, the reality is, why should we go to the market, give people a higher interest rate to do that which we can do ourselves domestically? And I get that people may feel a bit jaded because of the debt restructuring, but the reality is that that path was completely unsustainable and was likely to lead to default as opposed.
And she told us that too. Where we have difficulties and where the fund helps, this is not even so much the money, you know. It's in the technical expertise and the technical assistance as well that allows us to do the reforms that we're doing in customs, that allows us to deal with the reforms that we're doing in the Ministry of Finance, that allows us to look and see how best we deal with the state-owned enterprises from a different perspective in terms of common procurement and other things that we may want to look at. So I want us to get out of the narrative, because that has not been Barbados' experience. Why we are going back there, we could easily go to the market. But I don't want to go to the market when interest rates are being increased. We can go to the IMF and pay a fraction of what the market will ask us to pay. And you guys know, you carry the stories every day from outside. Why the Fed has raised its interest rates, why the Bank of England has raised its interest rates. Yesterday, the pound fell to its lowest ever, and God knows how long, at $1.14 to the US dollar. So we know the reality that outside is overcast globally. And there's a possibility of not just some showers, but some hurricanes and some earthquakes and some other things that are destabilizing countries. All we're saying is blame the government, we playing inside the crease. We can step outside the crease to play a few shots when we can, but we want to work with the private sector to trigger the growth that is necessary. There are things that we're still not comfortable about as a government with respect to the facilitation of business. We're getting there. We have a digital system at the corporate affairs now in a way that we never did before. You can go and pick up a certificate of, no, not the incorporation, the other one, the one from the police. Certificate of character in a way that you couldn't before. Similarly, we're using that same digitized approach with the incorporation of companies and the basic functions. By next month, October, we expect to have even more functions available at the corporate registry that you can do. Now, here's the difficulty. I have to travel on Sunday evening to go to Paris for the day, literally, before I go to Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. Monday at lunchtime, I'm meeting with the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, otherwise known as the OECD. Why? Because they are the ones, for example, that continue to be able to put a lot of pressure on this whole question of a global minimum tax. Okay? Now, most of us in the world have agreed that this is invariably is going to come. But the problem is that they want transition by governments by 2023. Then they changed it to 2024 because of COVID. Well, 2023 and 2024 is still tomorrow for all intents and purposes. And therefore, countries like ours have to be able to argue that to be able to sacrifice that kind of corporation tax in that 18 months time period is gutma, is unfair, is wrong. And that even if you want to correct these issues, countries either have to be compensated or need a longer period of time to adjust. Because what you're talking about is effectively the equivalent of just about 10% of our overall revenue, which cannot be just put on the table so. Now, I don't want to go. But if I don't go, I have these conversations and the Director of Finance is going with me, then we are at risk of being a victim to decisions being made outside of our region, far less outside of our country. Wednesday, I go to give evidence before Congress in the United States of America in Washington. In the committee, the Financial Services Committee, remember we had the session here with Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Waters, and all of the other Congress people who came down. When they came, they promised that they would arrange congressional hearings for us so that we can make the case. Why? Because in the Caribbean, if banks can't get access to correspondent banking, you can't trade. There are banks now who are refusing to take in this region US dollars. Not local currency, but US dollars because there's no correspondent banking relationship. And therefore, these are the battles that we are fighting. Thursday, we meet with the Vice President of the United States of America to be able to report on the subcommittee that Barbados chaired, which was on the finance subcommittee coming out of the Summit of the Americas. The Trinidadians chaired the one on energy, the Guyanese chaired the one on food and security. So that these battles, and we're not going there just to have a conversation, we're going there to make a few points. Because the reality is that if the same resilience and sustainability trust that I talked about earlier with the IMF, this is the first time the IMF is lending long-term money. 20-year money with a grace period of 10.5 years. It means that we don't pay back anything for the first 10.5 years. And the interest rate is low. And the reality is that our problem with it is that by limiting it to a quarter has no relationship with a disaster. You understand? And in fact, the smaller the country, the more vulnerable they're likely to be in terms of disaster. So there are aspects of it that we don't agree with. But like with most things in life, you claim ground, you use it, and you go and fight again. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're claiming ground. The 210 million US, if I had to go and borrow 210 million US on the market now, what would be the interest rate? 8-9%? 8-9%. Go and do the maths. Go and do the maths. You want to borrow money from a fella, the fella will lend you $1,000 at 9%, as opposed to $1,000 at 2% or 1%. Which one you want? Why would you ask of government to adhere to different standards than you're prepared to adhere to yourself? And part of the difficulty, I understand it, when this government won 30 seats again, people felt that there had to be a right sizer. And the right sizer, regrettably, has a disproportionate impact in terms of facts sometimes. So when the facts are not correct, then it gives the impression that it happened to us last summer. Happened to us last summer. We walked this road with people already. So I get it, and I don't get upset by it anymore. And I tell my colleagues, don't get upset by it. But what we must do is correct the facts when they're wrong. And when the fake news comes out, correct it. When I heard I was in a plane crash, I run off the runway in Guyana. Best of my knowledge, I get down, get out the skyvan, walk out, and gone straight to the car. And I had to pinch myself and ask me, you sure you didn't have a problem? Yeah.
One, I want to get some indication as to what the data is that you're seeking from the private sector.
It's
If
their
it's-
performance data. So
And-
it would relate to production and performance data generally. It's what the Statistical Services Department will use to be able to calculate a lot of the data, GDP and different types of data, unemployment, employment, whatever, sectoral data. But I will say that one of the things that we want to do in the next year is move the Barbados Statistical Services Department from being a department of the ministry to being an independent statutory entity with its own board, advisory board, and also dealing with big data. Because as you know, big data analytics is critical if you're going to manage anything going forward now because of how much data is available digitally to persons. And I feel that the country deserves an independent entity that is not subject to the dictates of any ministry. And we've promised it, and we want to deliver it, and we hope to do so. But we need to have a healthy culture and relationship for data, because without data, your broadcasting entity may not know, for example, whether it will have enough money to pay you for the next 3-4 months. Data is critical for them to analyze, to know when to fix and how to fix problems as they exist.
And the other question was a part B to my initial question. Could you give us an indication how soon we should expect to hear about the pension reforms that the discussion?
NIS?
Yes.
I would hope that during the course of this month, we will be hearing back from the NIS board. As I said, I know that their consultations have been extensive. I know that it's not just been town hall meetings or sectoral meetings that we've had, but there's also been an electronic survey online, and there has also been, I believe, some kind of human survey for those who don't go online. And they also have been running their own models. They have a core group and an advisory group. I think you all wrote stories about that. Minister Jordan, I think, spoke about that earlier this week. And those groups will advise the board, and the board will then make its recommendations to cabinet. And we will then make the decisions and alert the country. But I want to repeat, there is no need to panic, and there is no crisis. What we are doing is taking a very long run-up, because we do not want to happen to Barbados what may happen to other countries with respect to running out of the funds to be able to cover the payments out. And I'm hopeful that by the end of this month, early October, we'll be in a position to make some public announcements.
Prime Minister, final question. Already I could hear some of the detractors saying that...
That means you talk to them regular.
I'm being devil's advocate here.
Well, you know why I love it though? Because I keep saying the more they detract and the more they do that, the sharper we become in terms of our focus.
Okay.
To be able to show people that what is causing us to come to work every day and to work 12 and 14 hours is not simply to pretend as if we work in, or as Trinidadians say, making as if, but it is really to bring substantive benefits to Barbadian people. And I'm satisfied that we've done so. As Ryan said earlier, had we not done the reforms that we did when COVID broke, God help us as to where this country would be now. Had we not taken the decisions to restructure our debt rather than sending home 7,000 people, as some of the detractors wanted us to do, then God help where we would have been. So please proceed.
Okay, so
share with me what you hear them saying.
being that mouthpiece at the moment, the question would be, obviously be, in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, as a result of this program that we are hopefully entering into. how is that going to be impacted?
But part of what we've committed to is bringing down our debt to GDP ratio, Oliver. And we've done that systematically. We had the hiccup with the pandemic. And because of the pandemic, we had to go and the ashfall, we had to go and hire people, because if we didn't hire them, how they would eat? How they would eat? So that we accepted that there would be an uptick in the debt to GDP ratio, both because of the contraction in production in the country. You shut down a country for how long? Better part of 6 months in 2020 or more, and in 2021 it was 3-4 months again. Must get contraction. Okay, so GDP will contract. Once GDP contracts, the debt to GDP ratio going to increase even if I don't borrow much. And the facts show that the contraction in GDP was far greater than the increase in debt. The increase in debt, look, put them in absolute terms. When we took over this country, the government, the debt was over 16 billion, about 16 billion, 15 point something, 16 billion. The debt is not even 14 billion. In spite of all of the borrowing that the detractors tell you we're doing. But they don't tell you that the borrowing is to build capacity, or they don't tell you that the borrowing is to ultimately carry the country back on a growth path. But what they also should tell you is that the borrowing is not outstripping our capacity, and that it is sustainable. And that is why we have committed to bringing it down gradually over a period of time. Now, the initial thing was a big drop. And we've said to them that in our view, 6% primary surpluses are unsustainable. We did it once, we could have done it, but having gone through COVID, and having gone through the ashfall, and having gone through the hurricane, and now going through the inflationary pressures from the Ukraine war, we don't believe that a 6% primary surplus is the kind of thing that is sustainable. And I use the analogy many times. Remember, you can lose weight at 2 pounds a week, 4 pounds a week, 6 pounds a week. Try and lose it at 6 pounds a week and see what happens with you. You're going to fall away and fall down. Bad feels. So it's not sustainable either. Just as debt accumulation is not sustainable.
All right, final question from me. You mentioned that you are going to be talking with the OECD, and yourself, as well as Minister Strawn, spoke about the fact that some private sector entities are not compliant. I just want you to show the correlation between this lack of compliance and or grey listing when the OECD begins to suspect that our companies might be involved in anything nefarious.
Right, it's two different things completely. The OECD's thing related to and the blacklisting which we had from them, and ultimately grey listing, related to historic facts going back to 2014 to 2018 June. So that we are really just serving the sentence for a period of time that's gone. You would recall, and I said it last Friday, regrettably, at Ben Arendel's funeral, who we will miss dearly, that the first 6 months of our government was to change 14 pieces of legislation that allowed us to become fully compliant. We've done so. There's some tweaking that we have to do. The issue with the OECD that I'm speaking about on Monday has less to do with the blacklisting and more to do with the time frame for the global minimum corporation tax. The lack of compliance of the private sector companies related to their compliance with respect to domestic issues, supplying data to us to allow us to be able to do appropriate measurements and to benefit from it, because we really believe that there's more economic activity going on out there than the government is capturing. That's the truth. And we all know people who do the thing but don't pay taxes, or do the thing but don't come into the system. And we need to get everybody to understand that when you're doing that, you forget that you're driving on roads that you don't want to have serious potholes in, or that you may have to go to the hospital and want to know that the hospital got the medical supplies and the different things that they have there. And there's a good old time saying that a little with content is great gain, and many hands make light work. If we don't all pull together and help carry the burden of the cost of public goods and services in this country, then it means a disproportionate burden will fall on a few. Secondly, when I say that a little with content is great gain, whatever you are earning, you need to put a little one side there for the government to deal with the fact that it is the government who is causing our children to be educated. It is the government who is providing the health services that we rely on, even if sometimes people want to quarrel about them. It is the government who is fixing the roads. It is the government who is providing public transportation. It is the government who is dealing with the collection of garbage. In some countries, you've got to pay for the collection of garbage. It is the government who is keeping water prices relatively low in this country as compared to other Caribbean countries where water prices in Antigua and Bahamas and elsewhere are significantly higher than what we pay in this country. So that when the government says to us, put a little something on the table there for me, please, so that all of us can pay. And those who are employees carry the disproportionate burden because it's taken up by your employer before you go anywhere. But the self-employed and the others in the society need also to recognize that if we all do it, then many hands can make light work. And I want to end on this. You know, we got short memories, you know. What did I announce in 2019? We forget that in an IMF program, and I'm going to end on these things and you can take them wherever you want, because for those who say that an IMF program is only bad, in an IMF program, this government has bought the largest number of electric buses per capita and in absolute terms in the Caribbean. In an IMF program, this government has fixed temporarily the South Coast sewage system. In an IMF program, we bought $10 million in equipment for MTW to help them do some of the work on the roads beyond the other contracts that you see them doing. In an IMF program, we also ensured that we gave an increase that was sustainable and comparable to what we felt we could carry at the time for public servants. In an IMF program, we built a new accident and emergency department. And let me remind you, had we not had that, can you imagine what would have happened when the protocols for COVID kicked in with the old A&E, and what would have happened with being able to accommodate persons in there just to be able to be seen? We all know what the old A&E looked like. So all of these things were done, but here's what was also done. People earning between $18,000 and $25,000 are now getting a reverse tax credit. Didn't happen before. Happened in an IMF program. People earning between $25,000, just over $2,000 a month, and just under $3,000 a month have not paid a cent in income tax. Ultimately, because what they paid, they've all gotten back as tax credits in each year. And long may we be able to afford that. But we've done tax credits because the year that we can't, we'll tell you we can't. And the mere fact that we haven't clawed it back from people should be the clearest evidence that we're not in financial peril, as others would want us to suggest. In an IMF program, we've also reduced the income tax on all of the rest of you and put more disposable income in your pockets before COVID happened in 2019. And we haven't clawed it back in 2022. And I can go on and on. But because I don't believe that you should be in people's face every day talking, and because there's a handful of people who, as you said, would like to be distractors, we create this mood as if it's gloom and doom. This country has a bright future. And the bright future will encompass as many of us as possible. We've tried to create opportunities for persons with food security and in agriculture. And we're seeing the Lear's ground come up off of the ground, as well as Mount Poyer in St. Lucie. And we're looking to have the aqua farm start before the end of the year. We have also tried to be able to say that we can do the digitization. That started with the IDB program, and we want to move now to the digitization for the archives, which will involve probably hiring another, 150, 200, I'm not sure the exact number, persons to be able to digitize the archives over the next 3 years in the hope that nothing bad happens to them as happened in South Africa. So all of these things are happening. Now, is Barbados perfect? Nowhere in the world perfect. But trust me, we are doing far better than most. And we need to recognize that now is a time to build, now is a time to plant, now is a time to do the heavy lifting. And the Bible tells us that there's a time and season for everything, doesn't it? This is a time to build. This is a time to plant. This is a time for us to do the heavy lifting, knowing full well that if we stay focused Just as we've been able to carry people, we can do it again. And we have protection measures. If we really get hit badly by a hurricane, we know that we can suspend all of our debt, principal, and interest. We are the only country in the world that can say that at the level at which us and Grenada, and ours is far greater. And that's because this is what this government has negotiated. And we are currently negotiating pandemic clauses into some of our new debt too, so that should there be a further pandemic, and I say so to you, conscious that I chair the One Health Global Initiative with the other antimicrobial resistance that is killing too many people. So believe you me, it's not easy, and we can't do it alone, but if Barbadians bond together, and if we recognize as well that, and the big issue that we have to talk about, which I won't fully today, is the population issue. You can't have 1 in every 2 Barbadians in the year 2050 projected to be over the age of 65. Study ahead and tell me how you're going to build out this country with that. So the National Population Commission will start its engagement with the public later this year and start to let them know what they're recommending to us in terms of how we manage. And our first responsibility is to reach out to Bajans overseas. Bajan children, Bajan grandchildren, Bajan great-grandchildren, Bajan great-great-grandchildren. That's our first responsibility. And then after that, we look at other skills and services where we have a deficit, and investment where we have a deficit. So I look forward to continuing the engagement with the public. This is not an overnight discussion. This is not an overnight solution, but we are doing well, and we shall continue to do well. But we need all hands on deck going forward. And I trust and pray that when we are finished with the IMF discussions and we have the agreement, then we'll be in a position to report back to the public progress on that, and report back to the public progress on the negotiations with the unions, which will start, as I said, by the end of this month. Okay? Anything else? Thank you. Let me wish everyone a pleasant weekend. And as I said, I really am asking you to take out that story on compliance. It's not sexy, but it's critical, because the more we can measure what we're doing, the more space I have to help Barbadians as Minister of Finance. Swear to God. Okay? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Prime Minister, for both raising and addressing several matters of national importance. Thank you to Minister Strawn as well as Director of Finance, Mr. Carrington. Thank you to the members of the media who are here present with us, and thank you to you, the public, for joining us this evening. Take care and have a blessed weekend.